Hello and welcome to Seattle City Makers. I'm your host, Jon Scholes. Well, welcome to our latest episode, everybody, where I sit down with Andrew Thibault, who is the senior principal with EMC Research, a full-service research firm based in downtown Seattle with an office over there in the Pacific Building on 3rd Avenue. Andrew's been with EMC since 1995. He's conducted hundreds and hundreds of public opinion polls with Seattle voters on a variety of issues, from parks and public safety and the business environment and taxes and transportation and education. There's not a question, I don't think, that Andrew hasn't put to Seattle voters and the Seattle public generally through focus groups and public opinion research over his 2+ decade career with EMC. And there's not many people in the city of Seattle that have their finger more firmly on the pulse of the attitudes of Seattle voters than Andrew. We discussed some recent findings from a public opinion poll that Andrew and EMC conducted on behalf of the Downtown Seattle Association in May. They tested voter attitudes about downtown and its current revitalization and recovery, tested public safety issues and attitudes and perceptions around drug use, and also attitudes and perceptions around the importance people place on the health of downtown to a healthy city. We also get Andrew's take on just the current mood of voters in Seattle as we look ahead to the upcoming city council races on the primary ballot in August, where we've got 7 of 9 city council positions up for election. And we get his perspective on what he thinks the set of issues and the overall narrative will be as we approach those elections, and watch as 45 candidates dig in here and begin to campaign for office leading up to our August primary. We also get Andrew's itinerary for his perfect Saturday in the city of Seattle, our standard question on the podcast. So please stick around for Andrew's itinerary, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Andrew Thibault, the senior principal with EMC Research.
Okay, I'm ready.
This is us jumping in.
I feel comfortable.
Yeah, you look comfortable. You are the first guest, I think, who's shown up with a laptop.
I just wanted to have the data to look back at because there's some cool.
You don't have it all in your head?
I do, but if it's recorded, I feel more accountable for what I say. Whereas in a meeting, right. I'm like, yeah, they're not going to know.
Yeah, people can listen to this and listen again.
Yeah.
And check it against
right.
the real numbers. Well, thanks for making time for this.
Absolutely.
We commissioned you not too long ago to do some research of Seattle voters to understand their attitudes about downtown and other issues.
Yep.
So we'll talk about kind of what we learned, and
Absolutely.
It's gonna, and we've released that publicly now, and I think you'll be able to find it here on our website, downtownseattle.org, but we're going to get your insights. But I wanted to just first start with kind of your sense of, from the research you did for us, but the other research you're doing, as we look ahead to these elections coming up.
Yep.
7 of 9 city council members running, big debate recently around legislation to deal with drug use in our city, 45 candidates or so filed. What's the state of the voter? What's like the average voter in Seattle, like where they're at with their attitude around the city and kind of the top issues?
Yeah. So I would say I would use 2 words that may seem like they don't go together, but I think really do based on the data. One is incredibly frustrated. That's 2 words. Sorry. Frustrated.
Hyphenate it.
And then I would say cautiously optimistic as well. So they're really frustrated with the lack of progress on the key issues that they've seen challenging the city now for many years, primarily homelessness and public safety, but also affordability issues and some kind of emerging economic concerns about personal financial situation. Voters are incredibly concerned about the future of downtown Seattle. They recognized how deeply connected it is to the success of the region, both in terms of the economy and quality of life. And they believe it can come back, but they want to see sustained, visible progress towards that goal of recovering. And central to downtown, when we ask people if they're coming downtown more or less often than they did pre-pandemic, anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 are saying less often. And when you ask them why, it's all about public safety. People don't feel safe coming down downtown. The numbers have improved somewhat during the daytime and a little bit at night, but it's still a significant problem. And they're telling us what they want to see done. They want to see that addressed. One of the things I like to always remind people is this: there hasn't been any change in the ideological composition of Seattle. Seattle is still
their values.
Their values still overwhelmingly progressive and Democrat. But what's really changed is the level of frustration around kind of the basics that are required for a city to function. Voters have gotten so frustrated that they're just looking for ideas and solutions.
Do you think voters are in a similar place as they were in the 2021 election? We elected a new mayor, city attorney, and at-large city council member. Is it generally sort of the same set of attitudes?
That's my sense. I think there's, as I started out with those two words that were really four words, I think the level of frustration is still that constant. And while there is some evidence of progress, and we're seeing that in the data, that, if you were a glass half full person, you might say people are getting more optimistic. I think what the data really says is they're getting less pessimistic. They're desperate to be optimistic, and they're looking for the signs that say, okay, it's all right to be optimistic about Seattle again, because quality of life is so central to why we're all here, that they want to enjoy that quality of life again. So I think that is the big question. Is that mood going to sustain itself through this election? And
we're not hopeless in Seattle.
No, we are not hopeless by any stretch of the imagination. Most people are still proud to call themselves Seattleites. They're just, and I know I'm using the word frustrated a lot, but that really is the best word to capture it, because voters recognize that these are complicated problems, but they also understand that we're a city with a lot of talented people, a lot of resources, a lot of committed people, and they don't understand why we're not making progress, faster progress on these core issues.
And they've done their job in agreeing to support a bunch of tax increases and hand over a lot of money. Do you think that's playing into some of the frustration of like, golly, we've done the right thing as good Democrats and progressives and voted for just about every tax measure that's in front of us, and why do our parks not look better and the streets not look better?
I think that's right on the nose. And so, back to that idea of Seattle is still Seattle. If you ask about tax burden right now, a majority of voters will say that local taxes are too high for the level of services they're receiving from the city. That doesn't mean that Seattle has suddenly become anti-tax. It's not. We pass huge ballot measures all the time. We just did a countywide. It just means they're giving more and more money towards the problem, and they're not seeing any progress. And if anything, they're seeing things getting worse. And so what they're really looking for is measurable, visible results, accountability, like all the basic things of a functioning government. I want to support, the voters are saying, we were happy to give you more money if we believe it will be spent in a way that helps address the problem.
Yeah.
And they just haven't seen
ROI?
that. Yeah.
And you pay attention and do work in other markets, other progressive cities, similar storyline from, some of our peer cities that have a similar political bent, where you've got progressive voters that want to see more progress?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say we're in a little bit better situation. While there's this undercurrent of pessimism, it's not anything near despair. We do a ton of work in the Bay Area, and they're having challenges that I think are more extreme even than what we're experiencing up here, and Portland as well. So I think we're in a better position.
More optimism here.
Yeah, more optimism here. We've also had a cycle that you pointed to last time where we elected what I will call practical progressives as opposed to, and just labeling so that we can distinguish, as opposed to ideological progressive. The ideological progressive is who's the most left, who's the most progressive on the ballot. The practical progressive is I'm coming from a place of progressive values, but I'm focusing on the basics. I'm focusing on results. We need to get these core functions under control and handled before we can start to look to that kind of next level of progressive wish list, right? And I think that's, I think we've seen that pattern writ large over the last, maybe 2 decades, where we went through a period of leadership that wasn't that practical progressive model. I think of Greg Nichols, right? And they built up this city that was really hitting on most cylinders. And so we had the latitude there, because the basics were taken care of, to start to look to those next kind of things we want to do as a progressive community.
Great economy, low interest rates, ton of investment.
All of that provided the conditions that allowed us to think that we had solved it, right? And so then we had, starting with McGinn, more ideological progressives coming in and saying, you're not doing enough in a progressive city. We should be leading on a whole bunch of other stuff. And so they built off the success of the practical progressives. That allowed them the space to do the things that they wanted to do. And then we've been through a long period, just, I think, starting to shift back in 21, where the ideological progressives were really driving the agenda, both both from the mayor's office to a large extent, but much more so from the city council. And I think what's happened is we've seen years of focusing on that kind of next level of progressive desires and not paying enough attention to the basics. And so now it feels to me, and this next election will confirm or blow a hole in this theory, that we're coming back to that practical progressive, that people aren't ready yet to go all in. They're starting to say, I'm seeing a little bit of progress here and there. That makes me feel good, but I'm not going to tell you we're anywhere near where we need to be. And I think there is an opportunity with candidates who focus on downtown recovery, who focus on public safety, who focus on homelessness, on these basic issues, to have another cycle like this. And then we're going to be, if that happens, we're going to be in a really interesting position public policy-wise moving forward.
Do you think the shift at the national level and the national political dynamics, moving from Trump to the Biden administration, was influential in some ways for voters in progressive cities having a higher expectation around the basics and delivering results, and sort of moving from that ideological progressive to practical progressive? I have this theory that there was electeds in a lot of progressive cities that spent 4 years engaging with Trump and national issues, and their voters sort of asked them to do it in some ways and said, step up, because he's challenging a bunch of our values and coming after our own cities in certain cases, and we need you to fight that fight. And they gave him a pass around dealing with some of the basics. And now those national political dynamics are not what they were. Do you think that has some influence on how places like Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, their voters are much more focused on nuts and bolts now?
Yeah. I think you're right on the money. It's interesting because my initial reaction as someone who's been researching in Seattle since '94 was, we're way too insulated for that kind of stuff to penetrate. Like we have our own things, and we have a high opinion of our own ability to solve problems and all of that. But as you were talking about it really does make a lot of sense to me that when this existential threat was surfaced in a really aggressive way, that naturally the conversation shifts to the realm of values. That makes a lot of sense, and also battle ready, right? And so when you're drawing up battle plans and you're I hate war metaphors, but on that battle footing, then the need for ideological consistency becomes much more important, right? It's us against them. It's much more consequential, and it has the passion and emotion that collecting garbage and making the streets safe and clear that just doesn't have, right? And it makes a lot of sense. So I think that dynamic, combined with the dynamic I was talking about earlier about kind of going from practical progressive to more ideological progressive, and one setting the conditions for the next, I think that all folds together in a pretty interesting narrative.
And certainly the conditions in cities, on the streets, in parks, in downtowns over these last several years, was influential as well. Just people seeing visibly for themselves, right? The problems getting worse.
Absolutely. Like public policy is usually in the realm of at least quasi-theoretical, right? Like you can think about how some things have impacts on you. I use parks. If you increase parks funding, I'm going to go. But when you're actually seeing the consequences day to day on the ground, and another thing to keep in mind is Seattle has I think a justifiably high opinion of itself as a city. And going back to the quality of life that I was talking about, we're not I don't want to say a great city or that we aspire to be a great city, but we aspire to be and think of ourselves as a city with a really high quality of life. We've got the outdoors, we've got the progressive politics, we've got, one of the most liberal business communities in the country that contributes to all of the things the city's trying to do. We're one of the most educated cities. We have tons of resources. And so to see this thing that, you were really, really proud of, and when your friends came in, you wanted to take them immediately
Show it
downtown
off.
and say, hey, look what we've got, right? When that disappears, like that's a really rude awakening. And if you roll in all those other things like smart, well-resourced, caring, all of those, and you think, how can this possibly be happening
why can't we
here?
figure this out?
How can we not figure it? I mean, we've got so many, companies that started from nothing and became, huge and world dominating, starting with Boeing. Like, we've solved massive challenges. How come we can't solve this?
I think part of that frustration is driven too by the fact that a lot of people come here and they don't want to leave, right? They come here and I want to make my home here. I want to raise my kids here. This is not a pass-through town for me. So they're super invested in the here and now, but also the long term, right? And then those that have were born here and they didn't decide to leave either, right?
Yeah, and another interesting element, or at least I find it interesting on quality of life. I think one of the byproducts of the pandemic was when downtown was taken away from us as kind of a restaurant, entertainment, going down to the market, all of that, it changed how people thought about downtown. We used to take it for granted that it would always be there. And, in the survey we did for you guys, we asked about how important is downtown to the overall quality of life in the city. And the numbers are off the charts. People really recognize that. And so that's kind of a silver lining thing. Now, the next step is we've got to get people back downtown so that they can start to recapture what they had pre-pandemic. Beating a dead horse until the public safety challenges are addressed, right? The worst thing that can happen is someone who hasn't been downtown for a long time comes down and has a bad experience, and you've lost them. Right? And so we're starting to see. I was in South Lake Union last week and with Amazon in 3 days a week. That's the first time I've been downtown since the pandemic where I felt like, oh, this feels like what old Seattle was, right?
19.
And I had a huge smile on my face because, I live here and I used to come downtown all the time and I was so excited by it. It also doesn't hurt that it was a beautiful spring day, right?
Blue sky helps. Yeah, big lines today at Skillet and
Love it.
And,
and
the coffee shops and
when you're happy to stand in a line for lunch again, like you've been desperate to get back downtown, and we just need to, keep expanding that, right? Like that is really critical. And just to harp on this a little bit more, like Seattle voters are incredibly sophisticated in how they think about things, and they understand interconnectedness in a way that I'm not always sure elected officials do. It wasn't that long ago, you and I both remember when one of the frames for our elections was downtowns versus neighborhoods, right? Remember that?
Yeah, politics around scarcity. Downtown gets something, you're losing something.
And the research we did for you, and we...
Do you think that was real back then, or do you think that was just what some political leaders wanted folks to believe because the narrative was convenient for them to use?
Yeah, so you set me up for one of my favorite polling cliches, which is perception is reality. Yeah. So it operated
enough.
Right. It operated as truth in our elections, right?
Yeah.
Candidates ran that way. And, I think like every frame, it was exaggerated, but there were elements of it. one of the things, and this is not my insight, actually heard it from Tim Cease when we were on a DSA panel together. He said, I wonder if part of that is about we now have districts. And so you can be sure that there's somebody who's supposed to be looking out for your, and I mean this in a neutral way, parochial interests, right? And so it isn't that battle trying to get some of the at-large to pay attention to your neighborhood. You already have that. And so now we can focus on, more real divides. And the truth is now, even people who don't live downtown or maybe don't work downtown recovery is central to their view of a candidate's qualifications to be elected. If they're not talking about that, and not just talking about it, but making it central to their campaign, voters know that they've missed the mark, because as downtown goes, voters recognize so goes Seattle, so goes the region to some extent, so goes to a large extent, so goes the state. But not just that, the new piece of that is so goes their own personal financial situation.
Were you surprised by that, the connection that people are drawing around their own economic standing and viability and the health of downtown?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of numbers, I was at first, and then when I thought about it, it made perfect sense, and it was an example of the voters thinking being ahead of my thinking, right? So they weren't saying, our interpretation of that is not because our economic numbers don't back up that people are really in danger here and that we're on anything like the cusp of any kind of economic correction or blip. But it's, I think, really their recognition of the threats to downtown, and that if downtown doesn't recover, there's a series of concentric circles of damage that's spread out. And so it's them thinking ahead. And I think it's another way voters are just saying, please, please, please do something about downtown.
So what else, we're kind of digging into the research you did for us around issues affecting downtown with 500 or so voters in a city in the field, middle of May or so, right? What else did you learn and find that surprised you?
That surprised me. I wouldn't say there's a lot there that surprised me, but it just put a finer point on what we've already known. We've known through other research that we've done, both public and private, and it came at it in a little of a bit of a different way, really centering downtown recovery in the conversation. But if there's anything that surprises me about all of this data taken together, is rarely do you see such a unified voice on what needs to be done, what the problems are, what voters want. Like it's glaringly obvious. And so the thing that continues to surprise me is the lack of dramatic, urgent action on that front, right? Like even if you're taking the steps, if you're an elected official and you see this data, which they have and will, you want to be out there trumpeting it every chance you get to talk about what you're doing on public safety and homelessness and downtown recovery. And it doesn't seem to me like the temperature is hot enough from that side in terms of acknowledging voters' concerns and acting on them. Because politicians are also in a real bind right now, because with 75% of people coming downtown less often than they were pre-pandemic, if downtown's starting to improve, there's going to be a lot of lag time before people actually come downtown and see it, right? And so there's going to be a lot of work, and there has been a lot of work that I won't say is going completely unrecognized, but is not anywhere near universally recognized. And that can get frustrating as a policymaker, because you're doing these things and people aren't seeing the results. But it's your responsibility to get that out there, what's happening and the positive results. And that has a follow-on effect of bringing people down, creating a momentum.
Yeah. But you think City Hall's not moving as fast as voters are saying they want them to move when it comes to getting downtown going again?
What I'm saying, to take myself out of the equation, is voters are saying that they're not seeing things move fast enough, right?
There's a distance between where voters are and where the electeds are.
Yeah. And the electeds may feel like they're doing a ton. The voters do not feel like that. And that's not on the voters. I mean, you can put it on the voters to say, oh, they should educate, but they're going to vote you out of office because you aren't talking about the things they care most about. And also, I think this I know this city council has a challenge, right? Trust is broken with this city council because as these basics were going unattended and exacerbated by the pandemic, and it all kind of started back in the debate about the head tax and how that made the council look. And then, there was this brief period of optimism at the beginning of the pandemic where we all rallied around local government and felt better. And then we had the summer, the protests and all of that. This council has a severe trust and reputation problem. Voters saw them dealing with things that they felt like were not central to getting a handle on the basics that help a city function. And that's okay when you've been handed a city that's functioning. But when it's breaking down and
you
have
use my park or my soccer field,
and you have a pandemic on top of that, you need to take a triage mentality, right? Like the most critical issues first. It doesn't mean that we've given up on any of those other things or values, but it's not the time or place for them, right? Get the basics right first.
And voters are distinguishing between the council and the mayor and who they're holding accountable, at least for now.
Dramatically, and it's not unheard of. Mayors typically, because they're individuals instead of legislative bodies, have better favorable ratings, and you get a honeymoon period. You think of the city council, when they really went upside down in terms of their favorable rating was during the head tax debate. And even if you're a new council member who gets elected onto that council still carries all of that baggage, right? And even if half of it turns over, until people start to see a really different policy direction from the council as a whole, trust and kind of the image or the likability of the council is not going to rebound. The mayor, his numbers are particularly strong given how pessimistic people are right now. They're pessimistic about the current situation. Again, they haven't given up. They still love Seattle. They're proud to call themselves Seattle. But his favorables in the 60s are really strong in this environment. But it's a matter of time with these kinds of things, right? If voters are putting most of the blame on the city council, but the longer the mayor serves, and if they don't start to see visible, sustainable results on public safety and homelessness, they're going to start to spread their circle of blame out.
And how would you describe sort of where the majority is at when it comes to dealing with public safety, dealing with public drug use? And they're having this debate about what to do about public drug use and whether to adopt new laws to give the city attorney here in Seattle more authority to prosecute. Where's the progressive Seattle voter on what they think should happen on those fronts?
Yeah, so there's been a shift both on homelessness and public safety. And I want to be clear that voters still want all of this to come from a place of progressive values, right? You want to lead with that. But when you start to talk about things like open air drug use, repeat offenders, retail theft, and voters have reached their limit. They want to be compassionate, but I think what they're discovering is compassion without consequences is a recipe for disaster. And that's what they've seen. And what the city is doing by having this approach is really putting the consequences on the rest of us, on residents, on businesses to deal with the problems of homelessness and public safety by saying we can't enforce, we can't clean up this encampment, we can't, do this or that. Then, the rest of us are left to deal with those consequences, right? And that seems very unfair to voters, right? Like, why aren't you doing your basic job? You're not removing the problem, you're just shifting who has to deal with it.
Shift the impact.
Right, shifting the impact, exactly.
So you've been doing this for a long time. How is your industry, the research industry, the polling industry changed over the years and how you understand and ascertain public opinion? Yeah,
so I seem to be giving a lot of it was the best of times, it was the worst of times answers. But, when I started interning for my uncle, who was a pollster way back, maybe in the late 80s, he would tell me stories about when he started, there weren't enough landlines in homes, so they had to go door to door, right? And so
to make up the difference to get a
representative sample, because there weren't enough houses with landlines that they could call, right? And you think about it, it was that same conversation early on when the internet became a thing, right? And I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't. Like, we were really hesitant about moving any portion of our surveying online because the digital divide, not everybody had access, and dial-up modems and all that. So the technology changes and how you get to respondents changes, and certainly response rates have gone down. But we adapt, and there's always going to be a need for good data. Like, I think of the work that you had us do and the work we do for the chamber as it's like a city council meeting where everybody has an opportunity to show up, not just the people who are angry. So because it's a random sample, anybody can participate, and it's representative of the entire voter base of the city. That's really important because you're hearing from all voices who wouldn't make the trip down to City Hall or get on a Zoom call, right? That's a very distorted view. And so getting back to what we do now is we do hybrid surveys. We do phone, which is mostly cell, but some landline. We do text to web. We do email to web. And what happens is there's an adjustment period before respondents start to get habituated to this thing happening on their cell phone, right? Like in the beginning when cell phones came out, if you called anybody and they didn't know you, like they were hanging up on you immediately, right? There was no room. But now it's ubiquitous, and you can't get to young people except through text and email to web to get a representative sample. There's been a lot in the news about polling over the last couple presidential cycles.
And the cynicism around the numbers
and
lining up with the results.
And I look at that as a completely different type of polling. There's almost no other polling that you do where there's such high awareness of everything that's going on that it's under a microscope 24/7. Yeah. There are these shifts that happen all the time. Think of a local race where that happens. A city, it just doesn't. There might be one thing that comes out. And so it's much more subject to external shifts. And so the recency of the data,
people's perspective on national
the
races and
trends
issues.
And waves. We talk about that. Those and not that local stuff isn't dependent on turnout, but it's easier to model turnout at a local level. And so I really think of that as a different animal, and that may just be convenient for me to think of it that way. But
That's interesting, though. So you think the attitudes around local issues are a little more hardwired. If I'm annoyed that the park's a mess on Tuesday because of certain issues and the city's not dealing with it, I'm probably still annoyed next Wednesday. And there's not going to be some media coverage that's going to shift my perspective.
Yeah, and it doesn't have, and this isn't true of all markets, certainly true here, it doesn't have the same partisan element, right? Where we get into teams and then the ability to deliver information is almost non-existent, right? Because I don't trust your sources, you don't trust my sources. And so, even though we think we have some hot elections here in terms of the temperature, they're really not. They're really relatively civil affairs. And I think there's also less knowledge. Like, it's not this 98% know who both the candidates are. And so it just doesn't have the same dynamics. And, I can certainly say this, and everything I've said so far is evidence-free or at least data-free. But we do know from our local campaign polls for ballot measures or whatever they be that, within a margin of error, they are still really accurate. It doesn't mean you don't ever miss. Sampling theory says that with a 95% confidence interval, to get a little wonky here, that means 1 out of 20 times your error is outside the margin of error. So like anything else, there are conditions that you have to be aware of, but by and large, our local polling has been really solid. And the other thing we look at to give us confidence in the data, not that this is any kind of a rigorous test, but does it make sense with your understanding of the external environment? We're all paying close attention to the external environment here, the policy environment. Does what voters are thinking and saying in the poll make sense? And is it consistent through the poll, right? You ask the same question different ways or slightly different versions. And we see a lot of consistency. I think, we always come up with stories to tell ourselves why what we're doing is working, but the story seems to make sense, right? It's not disjointed.
When you get checked at the ballot occasionally.
You get checked at the ballot, yeah. And the thing that people don't understand about polling, it has a margin of error. Where polling is, I think, least useful is in horse race numbers. It kind of tells you generically, it tells you the issues, kind of the relative position of the candidates, but the specific numbers, people get so focused on those. And there's always an undecided portion in that, and that's going to allocate itself some way. And where margin of error comes into force with the greatest emphasis is in really close races, right? Even if you have a significant sample and your margin of error is, say, and we never do this in Seattle, it's 2 points, right? 2 points in a close race.
Yeah.
You can be right within the margin of error, but have called the race the wrong way, or the data seems to suggest the wrong way. And so, we tend to discourage extreme focus on the horse race, and it's more about, who are the people who are persuadable and what are the messages.
So the 21 election locally was really about who's going to take on the crisis of homelessness with more urgency. That became sort of a wedge issue.
Yep.
Focusing on the revitalization of downtown was part of the subtext as well. What do you see this upcoming election really being framed around? What are we talking about in late July, early August around the primary in these city council races?
Yeah, I think it's what we've been talking about is downtown recovery, and the Venn diagram on these things is very overlapping. Public safety and homelessness. And I think, public safety a little higher because, and those things are also, everything's overlapping here, but public safety is the core function of government. And it is, and if you come down here and feel unsafe, it's a visceral, emotional experience. And that does so much damage. So it's going to be the people who talk about public safety and homelessness in the context of downtown recovery, but also in the context of our neighborhoods, right, and our parks, as you've talked about. And it's people who have thought about these things in meaningful ways and have a plan rather than slogans, that embrace accountability, that take on the question of broken trust with the council and also broken trust over city spending. Again, it's not that Seattle voters won't happily give the city more money, but they're not going to until they believe it's going to have an impact. And really, this was the word you used, impact, until voters want to see candidates with ideas that they feel will have immediate, sustainable impact. And this, this cycle of who can get furthest to the left that I think ran its end in the last cycle. I think we have at least another cycle where that's not the thing. We don't want to hear about how you're the most ideologically pure progressive. We want to hear about how you're going to fix the things that we see that are undermining quality of life for everyone.
What's your plan?
Yeah.
So we have two standard questions on the podcast. Andrew, I think you may have answered the first one, which was your first job. Were you a pollster at 17, or was there something else that you collected your first paycheck doing?
Yeah, so my dad worked for this company called Earth Satellite Company that used satellite images for crop forecasting, weather forecasting. And my first job was a summer job. They had giant magnetic tapes for satellite data that you had to put on these giant tape readers for massive mainframe computers. And I would take the night shift and change the tapes. And I would sit there and play adventure text games while waiting for the tape to run for 90 minutes. And then I would change the next tape. And my dad found out there was a rule in DC, and he told me, you're the boss's son, so you're going to have to work twice. And he found out that if you were related to management, they could pay you less than minimum wage. And I love my dad, but he found out a way to pay me $2 an hour to change tapes and get me to take the job.
And the night shift.
Yeah, I mean, I love the night shift.
Should you have gotten a premium on the the night shift? Or it was cool to be up at night as a kid?
So that's why, I needed some kind of advocate on my behalf. But I chose to do it. I knew the rules. But I was, I was in probably ninth grade or something like that. Eighth grade, I don't know. Yeah, making $2 an hour.
Nice. And our final question, our regular question, your perfect Saturday in the city of Seattle. What's your itinerary for how you're spending your Saturday? And it can be any time of year. You get to pick.
I love this question because I say to people when, I grew up on the East Coast, I say, living here, when people come to see me, I feel like I'm on vacation. So
when you have visitors?
Yeah, because there's so much cool stuff. And this gets back to downtown recovery that I'm so excited to show them, even though I've done it many, many times. So, it's get up and go to breakfast at either like Portage Bay or, we have so many great breakfast places. Come down to the market, wander around, get on a ferry, go over to Bainbridge Island, look back at the city and make them jealous as can possibly be. Walk up to the Harbor Pub over on Bainbridge.
It's a great spot.
Have some lunch. And there's a lot of dining out here, so you can't sustain it. But then come back, probably drive around Queen Anne, the View Park, all of that. If we're really adventurous, get an inner tube and go floating down at Magnuson Park. And then dinner at my favorite restaurant in all of Seattle, a little hole in the wall near my house called Casa del Mojito.
Where is this?
It's so if you're coming south on Lake City Way, and you can get onto the HOV lanes, or you can go off to the right.
Yeah,
it's just right down. It's a bright yellow building. He's moving in October across from the park that's up on Roosevelt, but it's kind of Cuban and South American. The owner, Loom, is he's one of the best guys I've ever met, does tons of stuff all through the city. But it's the greatest dinner spot because you feel like you found this little hole in the wall place. You're driving somewhere and it just happened to be, you stopped in and you just have the best time. The energy in there, the food is spectacular. Yeah.
I got to check this out. James is nodding. You've been up there? He's thumbs up.
I'd be happy to go with you. I love that place. We were there 2 nights ago.
I love it. Love it. That's a great recommendation.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for making time for this. This research will be available on our website, downtownseattle.org, and is out there in the city and in the hands of elected officials and candidates running for office. And we hope people pay attention to it. The data matters.
Yeah, thanks. Really enjoyed it.
Well, hope you enjoyed my conversation with Andrew Thibault. Thanks to Andrew for making time to join us on the podcast. I want to close out, as I do each and every episode, with a recommendation of what you just can't miss in downtown Seattle. This could be something new or reopened or something on the way. And I want to mention Taco Listo, a new taqueria that opened in the Railspur project down in Pioneer Square, I think earlier in May. It's a 110-seat restaurant with an outdoor patio. It looks like a great menu, and it's one of 4 new retailers in the beautiful Railspur project there, which is the site of the old FX McCrory's that has been completely redeveloped with retail and office and housing, and a hotel that will open in summer of 2024, Westland, a new boutique hotel that broke ground not too long ago. But plenty open today, including Taco Listo, which looks terrific. So go check that out. And a congratulations to Ben Bridge Jewelers for their recent opening and ribbon cutting on the new flagship store over there at 5th and Pine. It looks gorgeous. Congratulations to them. They moved from their previous location at 4th and Pike, where they had been for 94 years, had a temporary location for over the last couple of years in the old Brooks Brothers space, and now have a new home at 5th and Pine. So congratulations to Ben Bridge, a terrific Seattle company that's been deeply committed to downtown and our community. So great to see them with the doors open. Well, thanks for joining us on this episode of Seattle City Makers. Don't forget to subscribe, give us a review, drop us a rating, and we welcome your guest ideas as well. Seattle City Makers is presented by the Downtown Seattle Association with support from James Cito and production by Spark Creative.